Do you need to make a gauge swatch to start a pattern or wondering how many chains you need to start a blanket? Let me show you how to use a gauge swatch to determine that. To make a gauge swatch, you will need the hook you will be using for your project, the yarn you'll be using for your project, and a tape measure. If you are making a gauge swatch before starting a pattern, the pattern should say that like 4 inches will be 6 stitches or a certain amount of stitches. Make your chain a little bit more than that. So for example, if it says 6 stitches is going to be 4 inches, then do 10 stitches. So you're going to do 10 chains because you want your gauge swatch to be a little bit bigger than what is necessary. Your pattern should say that the gauge swatch should be a certain amount of rows of a certain stitch or a certain row in the pattern or multiple rows of the pattern. So follow that part of the pattern or that stitch as you make your gauge swatch. So your first row will start that off as either a specific stitch, like a single crochet, which is what I'm doing here, or certain rows of the pattern. For example, if it says to follow rows 3 through 5 of the pattern while making your gauge swatch, then your first row of your gauge swatch will be row 3 of your pattern. So why might someone crochet a gauge swatch? Well, there are 2 reasons. The first one being that you are about to follow a crochet pattern, and it suggests that you make a gauge swatch before you get started, which is a really great idea because everyone's gauge or tension is a little bit different. So I'll walk you through that. The second reason might be that you have a certain crochet stitch, yarn, and hook picked out, and you want to know how many chains to start with before you start your project. This is more applicable for something simple like a blanket. If you're making a gauge swatch before starting a pattern, usually you're measuring a 4 by 4 inch square within the swatch. It might be 5 inches or something, but for this example, we'll do 4 by 4 inches. So use your tape measure to measure 4 inches within your gauge swatch and count how many stitches are in those 4 inches. For me, stitches, so that's the width, is 7 stitches. So those 4 inches are 7 stitches. And you're going to hope that that matches up with what your gauge swatch in your pattern suggests it should be. So that's 7 stitches that way. And then for rows, we'll measure the rows. And for me, within those 4 inches, I have 7 rows. So that's pretty common for single crochets, which is what I used here. That will be the same for your stitches and rows, but it's not always the case for all stitches. So my 4 inches by 4 inches is 7 stitches and 7 rows. If you have too many stitches in your 4-inch swatch, go up a hook size, and if there are too little, go down a hook size. You could also try using a different yarn. If you're trying to determine how many chains you need to start your blanket, this is the math you need. So for me, it's 7 divided by 4. So how many stitches you have divided by 4 inches. That number for me is 1.75. Now think about how wide you want your blanket to be. Let's say you want it to be 50 inches. So 1 inch would be 1.75 stitches. So I need to times 50 by 1.75. And that will give me the correct number of stitches I need to begin my blanket, or the correct number of chains. So 50 times 1.75 equals 87.5. Obviously, I can't start my blanket with half a chain, so I will round that number up. So 87.5, I'm going to round up to 88. If you're working with a stitch that works in multiples, say it needs to be like in multiples of 3, adjust that up or down by your own discretion to match the multiples. So then you can start chaining how many chains you need to begin your blanket. I really hope that this video was helpful. Remember that you can find me on TikTok and Instagram as well. And if you're looking for a pattern, you can find them on modernmade.net. Let me know in the comments what you are going to make, and I will see you next time.